Friday, the Asian American Forum sponsored a discussion on the impact of the Gulf War on South Asia. The guests are 4 journalists who talk about the events in the Middle East since Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August and how they have affected the Asian continent, focusing on the role of the United States and the impact of the military conflict in the Middle East. You will hear from the Washington bureau chief of the Times of India, the former associate director of the Afghan Media Project, the editor of the Eastern Times, and the president of the Asian American Forum.
Selig is a former Washington Post foreign correspondent. He's author of 5 books on U.S. relations with Asia. Mrs. Ambassador, will you please take a seat up front? We have the wife of the ambassador from India and the ambassador. Mr. Harrison is a graduate of Harvard, where I see he was also president of the Harvard Crimson. And after that, he started his career as a journalist. And he started it in India, in Asia, as a reporter, foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. And we look forward to seeing the way he is going to guide and respond to and analyze the remarks of our 3 distinguished journalists who will speak to you very shortly. I would like to turn this over now to you, Selig.
We are meeting at a time when the war in the Gulf is still a subject of debate throughout the world, and of course it will be for quite some time. This week, that we have a UN report, the report of a UN mission confirming estimates of 80,000 to 100,000 Iraqi casualties, and telling us that the results of the war have been near apocalyptic, that Iraq has been bombed back to a pre-industrial age, these are the words of the UN report, and may be on the verge of epidemics and famine. It makes Americans feel very good, to feel strong and powerful. But by the same token, other countries don't like to feel weak and impotent, and particularly third world countries that are in reality low on the power scale in the world. We'll be talking today about what the war has meant for the countries of South Asia, not only economically, where the impact has been very damaging, but politically, in terms of their relations with the superpowers, about the complexities in the way different groups within these countries have reacted. So we'll be placing the impact of the Gulf War in the larger context of the end of the Cold War, and indeed, the Gulf War is directly related to the end of the Cold War. This has helped to build up the power of the armed forces in Pakistan at the expense of democracy there. It's forced India to spend more on arms than might have otherwise been the case at the expense of its economic development. And of course, what the Cold War has meant for Afghanistan, it meant a very hot war, is still fresh in our minds, since it was just 2 years ago that the last Soviet soldier left after 9 years of occupation. An occupation that left at least 700,000 dead, 1/3 of all villages destroyed or seriously damaged, 500,000 widows and orphans, and it hasn't ended because both the Soviet Union and the United States are still pouring hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid into the two sides in the Afghan civil war every year. When I thought about the discussion today, I remembered a dinner party in early 1953 that Barbara and I attended at the home of a friend in the American embassy. This was when I first realized the Cold War was coming to the subcontinent in a big way, and it's sort of stuck in my mind. One of the guests was a good friend who was the CIA station chief in India. He'd just come back from some important meetings in Washington. He was very pleased and excited. He was on a real high. And he told me with great delight about a secret decision that had just been made that would be made public within a few weeks about the conclusion of a military aid with Pakistan to defend South Asia against communist aggression, he said. Well, we had quite an argument. I asked him whether, in the first place, I asked him whether Pakistan wanted these weapons for use against the Soviet Union and China, or whether it wanted them with respect to its balance of power against India and Afghanistan. And I asked him whether the consequences wouldn't be that India would turn to the Soviet Union for military hardware, and that Afghanistan, which hadn't gotten along very well with Pakistan, had territorial disputes significant one with Pakistan, wouldn't turn to Moscow also for military equipment. And he was very impatient with all this, and told me I was very naive, that it didn't matter what they did, that what was important was that countries had to choose sides. And we had to help those willing to be our allies, that you couldn't be friends with everybody in this world, and would have to build up Pakistan to create a more reasonable balance of power in that part of the world. And so we did end giving up Pakistan, $1.5 billion in military aid in the 1950s. And it should be recorded that there was a quid for the quo. We, the United States, got the use of Pakistan for electronic intelligence observation of Soviet missile testing sites. But India and Afghanistan did turn to Moscow as their major source of military equipment. During the 60s and 70s, the Cold War was coming to Afghanistan in a big way because the Soviet Union, which was providing the majority of the military hardware to Afghanistan, was using this military aid to organize friendly officers in the Afghan armed forces. And in 1978, these officers staged a communist coup in Kabul. That led the U.S. to resume military aid to Pakistan, and we, of course, have provided another $3 billion since 1981. We will be asking basically today whether the end of the Cold War means that India and Pakistan have a better chance of peaceful relations, or are they, in fact, headed for a nuclear confrontation? We'll be asking what hope there is for peace in Afghanistan. I've asked the panelists to cover a rather wide range of aspects of these issues in a rather short period of time and to try to touch base on some major themes, such as, first, the impact of the changing U.S.-Soviet relationship on Pakistan and India. How have the foreign policy and defense policies of each been affected? How has it affected the relations of the two superpowers with them? The Indo-Pakistan relationship, and what kind of changes in American and Soviet policy would be desirable to promote peace in the region? And of course, in the placing this together with the impact of the Gulf crisis and the impact of the crisis on economic life and political life, as well as the way in public opinion in these countries looked at the Gulf War, and what role each of these countries might play, would like to play, may play, should or shouldn't play in the Gulf security arrangements that are now evolving. In the case of Afghanistan, the questions I posed to Mr. Naweed are somewhat overlapping, but they're focused on this particular problem, the Afghan problem, which does overlap with the other issues in the subcontinent, but which has more to do with what the future of prospects for a resolution of the Afghan civil war are. We have an excellent panel, and we're going to begin with presentations by each of the three speakers, followed by a brief discussion among the four of us, in which we'll try to develop any of the disagreements that we may have had, and then we'll open to questions from the floor. Gautam Adhikari, who will speak first, over on my left, is an associate editor of the Times of India. He is based in Washington, where he covers all of North America and contributes very interesting stuff to the editorial pages also. He's been with the Times of India for 12 years. He served as a resident fellow and adjunct lecturer in the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard just before coming to Washington 3 years ago. Mohit Shah, to my right, who will speak second. Mohit has served as deputy editor of The Muslim, which, as many of you know, is one of Pakistan's leading newspapers in Islamabad. And Hamid Naweed, to my left, is an Afghan journalist, where he served as director of the Afghan Media Project, which disseminated information on the war to foreign journalists coming in for their quick visits to make a soundbite on the evening news. He did regular broadcasts for CNN during the last year of the Soviet occupation. Let's turn first to Gautam Adhikari.
Thank you very much, Sig, and good morning to everybody. We can very frequently change our views and opinions as the facts change. This is a problem that I fear that many of us are facing in India today, that the facts have changed in the world, but opinion in India is taking much longer than the rest of the world to change. Indian foreign policy in the post-Cold War and post-Gulf War stage. The post-Cold War stage has meant the end of alignments as far as the world is concerned. That what has emerged is not a multipolar world replacing the earlier bipolar one, but for now at least, it is a unipolar world, with the United States more or less striding like a colossus on the world strategic and political scene. But India's foreign policy has been based for decades on non-alignment. In this age of no alignments, non-alignment might prove extremely difficult to follow as a policy.
Thank you very much. That's given us a lot to think about. And now Mohit Shah.
South Asia has gone through a considerable ferment in and around the region. It has seen a very major superpower intervention in Afghanistan. It has now seen the first modern American-Muslim war, again around the region. It has seen violent deaths of heads of states in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Afghanistan. It is also currently seeing insurgencies. So the entire region is in a considerable state of ferment. But this is also one region which is considerably, I think, significant for global interest. This is one area in which a conflict has the potential of flaring into a nuclear conflagration. The end of the Cold War, signified by the Soviet exit from Afghanistan, has led to the slow unraveling and distancing between the two countries. Now, with the Soviet Union, although the Soviet Union has recently warned Pakistan that they should not meddle in Afghanistan, but the Soviet ambassador in Pakistan, Yakunin, recently wrote an article in The Nation, and he said that the relations between Pakistan and the Soviet Union have improved considerably. And significantly, he added that we are encouraging our Muslim republics to develop closer ties with Pakistan now. And most importantly, I think this crisis demonstrated the great power of pan-Islamic solidarity, because there's a great paradox on this issue, that Iraq has been a very close ally, probably the most closest ally in the Arab world of India, and has been supportive of India's stance on Kashmir. In a way, it also, the crisis over Kuwait led to a feeling of heartburn in Pakistan over the issue of Kashmir, because people started comparing that there are already pending resolutions over the issue of Kashmir. So it shows that the Islamic factor would be a considerable factor, because the Islamic factor causes considerable ripples in Washington. It also scares the Soviet Union because of its impact on its Muslim republics. And also on the issue of Kashmir.
Now, Hamid?
Yes. My name is Hamid Naweed. I'm from Afghanistan. It's a pleasure to speak in front of you today over the issue of Afghanistan. It's about 2 years that the Soviets have left the soil of Afghanistan now, and there was big hopes that there will be significant changes in Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal, because the Soviet withdrawal in Afghanistan was preceded by major world events, especially in Eastern Europe, and it was followed by the fall of Wall of Berlin. And there was major hopes for the Afghans to see, as a result of the ending of the Cold War, there will be some sort of political settlement in Afghanistan, which will be in accordance with the desires of the Afghan nation, the majority of the Afghan nation. But the events which took place since last year, from the time that there was a conference between Mr. Shevardnadze and Mr. Baker in Irkutsk of Siberia up to now, although there have been lots of talks about peace in Afghanistan, but we have not seen any direct result of these talks in Afghanistan. Still, the Soviets are supporting the Kabul regime. As a matter of fact, yesterday, the Soviet ambassador in Kabul said that they are ready to continue the aid to Afghan regime. And still, there are hostilities going on in Afghanistan, and still there are major supports by the Western countries, especially United States and Pakistan, for the Afghan resistance, especially to very fundamentalist parties. So the situation is as of today as it was 2 years ago when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. And it was January 15th of 1989 when the last Soviet troop left Afghanistan. At that time, the Kabul regime was very vulnerable, and it was in the point of collapse. Unfortunately, because of the interferences of other Afghan neighbors into issue of Afghanistan, especially Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the wrong policies of United States of America towards the aspirations of the Afghan people, and what happened in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and that year, 1989, in a fake government was trying to be pushed on the throat of the Afghan nation. The Kabul regime started having a little bit by bit, some prestige. You know, it just, people start making comparison of another puppet government replacing the Kabul regime. As a matter of fact, what was very difficult for the Afghans at that time, to find a new alternative for the Afghan government after the Kabul regime's possible collapse. The events which happened in Jalalabad following the emergence of the IUAM, the Afghan interim government in Pakistan, which was as a direct result of Pakistan ISI and to a certain degree by American diplomats in Pakistan, resulted in killing of more than 11,000 Afghans, which I witnessed there. I was in that time in Pakistan. Actually ruined the credibility of Afghan resistance. And then the reason for that was that majority of the Afghan commanders did not participate in this war because they thought this was a war which was injected by the foreigners on them. At that point, when I was in Pakistan, I witnessed from the time that the Soviets were starting to withdraw their forces, which was August of 1989, they start withdrawing their troops from the southern areas of Afghanistan. The commanders from inside Afghanistan start coming to Pakistan. From the western provinces, from 10 western provinces, about 2,000 people came. And from eastern provinces, people start coming to Pakistan to question the leaders of the resistance. What will happen? What kind of government would take place in Afghanistan? And majority of the people wanted to have a government which will be protecting the Afghan traditions and Afghan entity and will be in accordance with our traditions. But unfortunately, because of the involvement of Saudi Arabia and finances that the Saudis were giving to the Afghan resistance, the United States had its own designs and Pakistan had its own designs. That kind of government did not take place. But Afghanistan agenda was to have an Afghan assembly based on Afghan traditions, which is called for Loijerga, and they will call upon all the tribes of Afghanistan, major commanders, intellectuals of Afghanistan who have been in abroad to form the Loijerga and then select a person at that point to make a government. But the fear of Pakistan and Iran at that time was that that person might be the king of Afghanistan, who was living in exile in Rome, and the king might become a strong figure for Afghanistan. And I can vouch that the king at that time had a majority of the support of the silent population of Afghanistan who were not represented as parties. One has to go back now to see what happened in Afghanistan, why the king was ousted from the power, how President Dawood, who was his cousin and his brother-in-law, took power. After 1973, Dawood made a coup against his cousin, the king, and king was gone to Rome. At that point, Dawood had the support of the leftist parties of Afghan people. But he was trying to change very slowly towards the West, and then he started speaking with the Shah of Iran. He was trying to get more legitimacy recognition by the non-aligned countries, and then he started moving towards West, but West was very slow to respond to Dawood. Actually, they were very skeptical of Dawood Khan, and they did not like him. So subversive activities started against Dawood Khan by very radical Islamic groups supported by Pakistan on the other side of the border, who were living in exile there. And we have some evidence that the US was supporting those radical elements at that time. That was prior to Soviet invasion. But at the same time, when Dawood Khan started changing his policies, breaking away from the Soviet influence, the Soviets started also acting very strongly in Afghanistan. So the very strong leftist elements in the military, especially, they started doing terrorist activities in Kabul. So both sides were fighting against a moderate, legitimate government, till that government collapsed in 1978, and the Marxists took control of Kabul. And since then, the issue of Afghanistan became some sort of more of an international issue. At the time of the Marxist coup, President Carter was in charge of the United States. Mr. Carter's reaction was that it was not a very significant change in the world, although the Shah of Iran personally called him and said this is a move of the Soviets in the region, but they realized that's only a nationalistic revolution of Afghanistan people by itself. And then, because of the changes which took place in Iran at that time in 1979, and then the changes which took place in Pakistan, Mr. Bhutto was ousted, Mr. Zia-ul-Haq came in Pakistan, although Mr. Dawood and Mr. Bhutto reached to some sort of agreement before this. But when Mr. Zia-ul-Haq became a powerful man in Pakistan, all those treaties were not respected as much as they should be. So there was some people are thinking that Soviets felt threatened and they entered Afghanistan, but some people think that at that time it was during the Brezhnev era and it was the time of the Soviet expansionist policy. But anyway, the response of the West was very, very slow to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was just verbal condemnations. And that's one of the things that Afghan people are now making parallels between the United Nations resolution about Afghanistan and the United Nations resolution about the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq. Because in the United Nations resolution about Afghanistan, all the members of the General Assembly voted that the Soviets should withdraw immediately, total unconditional withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, but it was not supported by the Security Council major powers. It was vetoed many times by the Soviet Union. And now people are saying that Afghans are saying that United States of America and Western countries are very, very firm on the United Nations resolution on the issue of Iraq, and people of Afghanistan feel that they are being mistreated in this whole international law. But the situation during the time of Mr. Reagan was very different. When Mr. Reagan took office in Washington, he was talking more about the issue of Afghanistan, and he was speaking more about the issue of Afghanistan between 1980 and 1984. And But after 1984, some help start going to Afghanistan through Pakistan. But the issue of Afghanistan became monopolized by very right-wing anti-communist organizations which were trying to use the issue of Afghanistan as a propaganda model for the cause of Nicaragua's freedom, for the cause of Angola's freedom. And then there was not so much of bipartisan support, although it was on the Congress, but it was just becoming a very right-wing issue. And that hurt us in the long run very badly, especially when Mr. Ziaul-Haq was the president of Pakistan, and he was trying to make the issue of Afghanistan, change it to an Islamic issue rather than Afghanistan's independence. And some scholars also combined with the policies of Pakistan at that time, and some Western countries wanted to change this to a war of communism against Muslims and a war of Muslims against the communism, which could go for generations. But as far as the Afghan people were concerned, they wanted to have their independence and their freedom like they had before. During these times, some very party-oriented commanders were promoted by the Western media and by the government of Pakistan, and about 2,000 more commanders which exist in the Afghan fields were ignored, so nobody knows about them. So few individuals were promoted, which does not represent necessarily the whole Afghan nation. And that's the problem, because nobody tried to understand the political and sociological structure of the Afghan people, the tribal structure of the Afghan people, what the Afghan people want, because we have a history for ourselves. We have national characteristics which are different. And people try here making parallels between the Iranian fundamentalist movement in Afghanistan, and that's why the resistance have not been able to topple Kabul regime, because after the Soviet withdrawal, the Kabul regime started to take steps toward more to look more nationalistic. And since the Afghan people are very nationalistic people, so they're not trying to topple this government, even it's a communist government, and people do not like it because it's a puppet of Soviets, and to replace it by something else. But right now, situations are changing. As the gentleman from Pakistan said, the war of Iraq had a very strong impact on the masses of the Afghan people, because the same way we condemned Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, now people are losing trust for the Western countries, because people are looking during this 10 years of war towards America as a source of freedom, as a source of democracy, and as a source of a country which is trying to help the people. But now they're seeing what has happened in Iraq. It has divided the Afghan resistance, unfortunately, into two groups, some who are supporting, very few, which was forced to support actually the United Nations resolution on Iraq, and majority of them are not, because they're saying a Muslim country was invaded by 36 other countries and major powers from the Western world, and it is a threat for all of us. So that leaves us in a very bad dilemma right now, especially when this Pakistan and United States relation has become very stale. So the Soviet Union is trying to develop its relationship much closer to Pakistanis, to bypass United States and peace negotiations over the issue of Afghanistan. So at this point, it's a very confusing point for the Afghan people. But we have still our agenda. Our agenda is our freedom, independence, and respect for our self-determination, but which is not listened to the Afghan to the rest of the world has not listened to this plea of the Afghan nation. But the agenda has been always there. People have said it to the policymakers of Pakistan, Afghans have said it to the policymakers of United States, the Soviet Union knows about it, Iran knows about it. Still, everybody's trying to help their clients in Afghanistan, and unless there is not an international agreement on non-interference in Afghan issue, the dilemma of Afghanistan and the war and the destruction of Afghanistan would unfortunately continue. I have to conclude now.
We do want to allow very ample time for discussion. We have the Ambassador of India in the front row, and we have former Ambassador Hummel and others. But I want each of you just to say in one or two sentences, first, sum up the way in which the majority of the people and the majority of the officials in your respective country, and in the case of Afghanistan, a somewhat more complex answer, felt about the war and about what the future of American policy should be, both in the Gulf and in India and Pakistan. Just a brief picture of your basic attitude would help us to keep all this in focus, I think. Do you want to start, Calvin?
The public opinion polls that we had in India during the Iraq War showed a somewhat different picture from what was reflected in the press, particularly in opinions, and what was reflected in the demonstrations, which were mostly, I think, led by organized agitationists.
I think that on the first point, end of the Cold War, I think that there is significant concern in Pakistan and also in other parts of the Muslim world that the end of the Cold War should not start the beginning of the new Cold War with the world of Islam. And that, I think, is, they feel that the red menace should not be replaced by the green menace, and the bogey of the hammer and the sickle should not be overshadowed by the specter of the crescent and the star.
What U.S. policy in Afghanistan should be. 2 seconds.
The U.S. policy in Afghanistan should be to recognize the right of the Afghan nation and the aspiration and desires of the majority of the Afghan nation, the silent majority, which has not been represented, unfortunately, by the Kabul regime, which cannot be represented by the Kabul regime because it's an illegitimate regime, and it cannot be represented by the parties which was a product of war. It should continue all sorts of humanitarian aids for Afghanistan because the situation is getting out of hand. In majority of the places we have major diseases, lots of child mortality, but the military buildup has been already there. There have been talks always about negative symmetry, but we have not seen the result of it. But I think, first of all, the United Nations should step in strongly as it stepped in the issue of Kuwait. We have the right, every right, that United Nations should step in and have a strong resolution on Afghanistan, a fresh new resolution of Afghanistan about non-interference of Afghanistan neighbors, including the superpowers, and the self-determination process of Afghan people.
Thank you.
Well, see, the majority of the Muslim population are not supporting Saddam's actions over the issue of Kuwait or what Saddam has done in his own country. But the major issue for the Muslim population is the presence of alien forces in Saudi Arabia and re-emergence of Israel as a very strong force in the region. Of course, there are so many rivalries in the area, which will be financed, I think, by so many major countries, as we have the experience in Afghanistan, and we have seen the same sort of situation in Lebanon. But in general, I believe there is a period of reawakening in the world of Islam, because in Islamic world, all the way from the Soviet republics down to Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, because people of Muslim world see that they have been mistreated all these years by different powers.
Into this discussion of realism that we're having, I would like to ask a small philosophical question. Why is it that over all the years, religions, which are supposed to appeal to the highest nature of men, have caused so many wars? Why is it that Christians, Jews, and the world of Islamabad cannot live in the same world without fighting? Why can't we be supportive of each other's motives?
Any other comments on that question?
Well, I just tell you one of my experiences. A gentleman who was going to seminary wrote in Alexandria. He was a priest, and he asked me which religion I have, and I said I'm Muslim. And then we spoke about Christianity and Islam and how many close points we have and how near we are and major issues like the question of being just, loving your neighbor. All these concepts exist both in Islam and in Christianity, so there is no reason to fight. And he agreed, and we spoke for a long time. He said, my son, since you're living in America, why don't you become a Christian?
Thank you all for coming, and thank you all.